So welcome everyone to another Agora online event. My name is Nicola Bock. I'm head of events at Agora Energiewende, and we're very happy for such a great audience today. On the agenda today, we have climate neutrality by 2045. What does this mean for Germany and what for the EU Green Deal? Today's topic is what has been on the agenda since Germany's Constitutional Court declared the German Climate Act of 2019 as partly unconstitutional on 29th of April, which was just a few days after we published the study towards a climate neutral Germany by 2045. And we have already introduced the study to the German-speaking audience on 6th of May by our partner Stiftung Klimaneutralität, and together also with Agora Verkehrswende, with whom we wrote the study together. And we thought this might also be something interesting for the international audience, so we decided to add another webinar, and which is why we're broadcasting this today. The agenda is fairly easy. We will have some 40 minutes of presentation and then another, so to say, 30 minutes for your questions that we'd like to address in the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. At 12:30 Central European Summer Time, we should be finished. I would now like to introduce the panel, and in order to make you able to see actually the other participants on the panel, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Germany still has, so apparently still most people are tuned in from Germany, or there's a majority from Germany, but yes, Austria, Belgium, France, Korea, India is new, I didn't see that before, and Sweden, Romania also. What is BG? Maybe this person can, or these persons can put that into the chat so I can look it up afterwards. And you can still continue putting in the countries from where you're tuned in from, but I will stop sharing the screen in order to introduce today's panel to you. Let me start with Mara Marte-Kleiner, who is Senior Associate Key Policy Germany at Agora Energiewende. Good morning, Mara. Welcome to the panel. We also have Claire Stamm, who's Comms Manager for EU topics, and she's here today to look after the Q&A session. Welcome, Claire. We also have Robin Emline, who's Team Assistant in our new Brussels office, and she'll be looking after the chat today. Welcome, Robin. Good you're here. And then last but not least, we have Matthias Buck, who's Director, European Energy Policy, and he will, together with Mara, guide you through the presentation. But before we hit into the content part, let me make you familiar with the digital room, the Zoom environment. Some of you may already know it because this is sort of my every webinar little housekeeping slot. But I will still repeat it because I think there may be a few newbies in the audience today, and also it's good to be reminded. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you see two boxes. One is called chat, the other one is called F&A or Q&A, question and answers or Fragen und Antworten. We use the chat box for your organizational and technical questions, and Robin will be so kind to look after them and try to answer most of them. These will be invisible for the rest of the audience, so just put in there all questions or remarks. And Robin will also use it to put relevant links into the chat so that you know where to find the presentation, which is already online, where to find the different studies we are hinting at, etc. Now, for your content-related remarks and questions, you can use the Q&A box. This will be looked after by Claire, and she will then take as many questions as possible into the Q&A session. Usually, let me already tell you, we are unable to address all questions because there are just too many. But what Claire will also do, she will try to cluster so that we are able to address at least a good number of them. If there are any unanswered questions, you always have the opportunity to send us an email to webinar@agora-energiewende.de, and we can try to address it afterwards. But let's see how far we get. And one more information on the Q&A. These questions will also remain invisible until we answer them. And you will see some will be answered in writing and some will be answered live, so to say. And whenever we click the button, they will become visible. So it may be worth quickly checking what you've written just to make sure that there are no, in German, I know it's called Flüchtigkeitsfehler. And now I'm looking for that, word. And careless mistakes. That's it. Yeah, thank you very much. So we are recording this webinar because we want to make it available for the public afterwards. And as I said, if you're interested in finding out how many are in the audience with you, you can check on the top left next to the Zoom icon. At the moment, we are 220. And I do have a little control monitor next to me to make sure that you see what you're supposed to see. And with this, let me check. No, I haven't forgotten anything. So I would like to hand over the microphone to Mara and Matthias, and I look forward to the next 40 minutes of presentation. Enjoy.
Here we are. Sorry, I just had to check my screen so that I can actually share a presentation with you guys, which I will do now. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Now you should be able to see it, I hope.
Yes, looks fine, Mara.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone from our side as well. And we're very happy to present our climate neutrality study, which we have published in fall 2020 and then again in spring 2021, and talk to you about what does this mean for Germany, but also what does it mean for the European Green Deal. I will be talking about Germany mainly, and then hand over to Matthias for Green Deal part. I'm afraid I can't click my slides, can I? Okay, somehow my setup is not as I wanted it to have, so I hope we can work this out. Here we go. Now we are in the perfect mode. Again, we have published our study towards a climate neutral Germany 2050 in the fall of 2020. It was a study on behalf of us, Agora Verkehrswende, and the Climate Neutrality Foundation, or Stiftung Klimaneutralität, and written by Prognos Öko Institute and Wuppertal Institute, mainly with the mission to model the then set targets of the German government to be climate neutral by 2050, and the implications that came from the EU level, which was mainly the EU 2030 target of -55%. For all sectors. And by all sectors, we actually meant all sectors. So energy, buildings, industry, transport, and then also agriculture. Our goal was to present a path towards the climate neutrality and taking into account costs and acceptancy, and also basically had to model it bottom up. So we are not implicating certain paths onto sectors, but said, well, we have to look at what sectors can actually accomplish within a certain time frame. In spring 2021, so more or less a couple of weeks ago, we then presented a follow-up study, which was called Towards a Climate Neutral Germany 2045, which basically extended the logic of the first study and only said, well, we have to be more ambitious and look at climate neutrality 2045, which is 5 years earlier than the previous study. And then also for all sectors. And our goal was to present a path towards climate neutrality in 45, again, taking into account costs and acceptancy. We published this study on April 26th, at least in its executive summary, so it was not even the full study yet, but all the numbers were already there. And not knowing that the German Constitutional Court would actually publish their decision on the Climate Law 2019 just a couple of days later, on April 29th. And their decision was already taken in March, in late March, and they only published it in end of April. So for us, of course, that was a very lucky situation, being able to actually answer to this court ruling just a few days later. The court ruling mainly said that it was unconstitutional that most of the work that had to be done towards climate neutrality to be able to tackle climate change after 2030. And the basis of this ruling or this decision was we have to have a fair share of effort among generations. And if we have less ambition before 2030 than after 2030, then we actually put every effort that has to be taken onto future generations. And this limits the freedom of future generations. Hence, more efforts have to be taken before 2030. I would like to show you a few indicators of our study, and then go into what the climate law or what the decision of this constitutional court actually moved in the German debate. Our study is a growth study. So we say that we have an average GDP growth until 2050 of 1.3% per annum. So we invest, we have economic growth in there, but at the same time reduce our emissions by 30 million tons per year until 2050. Which is a little different than other studies. So this is not a sufficiency scenario, but it's rather a growth scenario, taking into account that we will still remain a very industrial country and an exporting country. The decision of the Constitutional Court then led to some very instantaneous movements in the German political debate, with a first proposal of a new or reformed climate law 2021 just a week later, and then a decision by the government last week to actually reform the climate law with the following indicators. First of all, they have decided to increase the ambition until 2030. Instead of minus 55% compared to 1990, Germany then with this law aims to reduce the emissions by 65% until 2030. Additionally, and this was only vaguely mentioned in the previous law, it set the new climate neutrality target, like really climate neutral, by 2045. In the previous law, this was kind of only mentioned as a sideline. It was not really part of the law, but it was also not part of the law. Now it's actually in there saying we have to be climate neutral by 2045 at the latest. Additionally, it includes LULUCF emissions, which was not part of the law before. The share of ambition or the increased ambition is mainly in the sectors of energy and industry until 2030, and transport and building only have some additional, but not really additional ambition or more emissions they have to reduce past 2025. A larger question is also still the agricultural sector, where we have much more ambition, though it doesn't look as much in the numbers itself, as it's still the smallest sector that's emitting in Germany. And then the law also includes some additional elements on governance, including some kind of council that has to be consulted when it comes to additional efforts. Additionally, it also set a timeline for when to define the next steps. So the next steps for after 2030 will have to be set by 2024. If you look at this graph as well, you can see that in the next 2 years, of course, there's not much difference between the climate law 2019, which is the purple line, and the climate law as it is proposed right now by the government to the parliament. But after that, in 2024, you can already see that the lines actually start going apart. Dotted in blue in there is our proposal, the Climate Neutral Germany 2045 study, which I've just only put in as a reference, showing that in the first few years, we actually said it has to be a little more, but then after that, after 2025, it's more or less what the German government now proposed. If we look at the sectors, we of course have a little difference in which sector has to do what. So how does this actually look like? How do we get from here, from 2021 to 2050 or 2045, and with regards to climate neutrality? We say there's 3 steps to climate neutrality in 2045. Today, as we already stated, the current still in place climate law from 2019 says we have to reduce 55% of the emissions until 2030. Up until today, we have already reduced quite a chunk, mainly in the energy and building sector, but some also in the industry. Part of that are also still kind of the wins from reunification in Germany in the 1990s. And if we, for example, look at transport, it's not really much done since the 1990s here. The plan until 2030 was to reduce emissions by 55% compared to 1990, mainly in the energy sector, some in transport, some in buildings, some in industry. And what the current ruling of the Constitutional Court, but also EU policy states, is Germany has to be much more ambitious until 2030. And the current proposal actually reflects this. We need to aim for at least 65% reduction until 2030 and a climate neutrality until 2045. What this means in numbers, you can see here. It basically means until 2045, we have to reduce emissions by 30 million tons per year and have kind of an intermediate step of 65% in 2030. Our first step basically means we have to increase this target. And this is what is already put into writing with the current proposal, saying we will reduce emissions by 65% until 2030. In our figures, this would mean the main chunk comes from the energy sector. It essentially means we have to go into a coal phase out. In transport, we reduce emissions by 73 million tons until 2030, industry 72, and buildings around 50. Some also comes from agriculture and waste, well, it's kind of marginal, let's say. The second step means reducing emissions by 95% until 2045. So in the next step, we mainly look at all the remaining emissions, and whatever we can avoid, we will avoid until 2045. We end up with a remainder of emissions of around 63 million tons per CO2 equivalent in 2045. And in the third step, we will actually account for them with negative emissions. And the carbon offset mainly includes industry and energy, and bioenergetic CCS, as well as direct air capture CCS, and some green polymers that can be used in the industry sector then. So our 3 steps are reducing emissions by 65% until 2030. Second step is then reducing by 95% until 2045 and accounting for the rest of those emissions, the rest 5% that we cannot avoid anymore, with negative emissions, especially in industry and energy. How do we get there? We have 5 central strategies to do that. First of all, increase the share of renewables drastically. We have to have an electricity share of 70%, a renewable electricity share of 70% in 2030, and 100% renewables by 2045 at the latest. Why is that? Well, it's actually the new backbone of any transformation strategy, and we will come to that later. What does that actually mean? Well, we have to increase capacity additions by a lot. We are currently around 1 to 3 gigawatts per year for wind and photovoltaics, but we will have to increase it to 10 gigawatts of photovoltaics per year and 1.7 offshore wind, 4.5 onshore wind. Is that doable? Yes, we do believe so, because we have seen it in the past. We have had the greatest added capacity per year for photovoltaics with 8 gigawatts in 2010 and 2012, with 2 gigawatts of offshore in 2015, and with 5 gigawatts in 2014 and 17 of onshore wind. So essentially, it means we have to start now, because every year we lag. Basically means we have to do much more in the year that is following. Second strategy is energy efficiency. While we have increasing electricity production, we will have to have primary energy consumption by 2045, mainly in the heating sector. So this means save as much as we can, so we don't have to produce as much as we have to. You can see here also that in 2045, the largest chunk of energy, of primary energy consumption, is produced by renewables. Some is PTX, and the rest is more or less neglectable. Third strategy, and as I mentioned that before, is electrification. Electrification becomes the backbone of any sector. We will have electrification in transport, heat and industry, with electric cars, heat pumps, electric boilers, which all replace oil and gas. All the fossil technologies we have in those sectors today will be replaced mainly with electricity. And you can see the figures here. You can also have a look at our study where this is more detailed. Fourth strategy then is hydrogen. And in our study, hydrogen is mainly used to safeguard the security of supply in the energy system, but also to create a climate neutral industry. And the demand, as you can see on the left, is mainly, it's about, I would say 60% is electricity and district heating and the safeguarding mechanism. And then the rest goes into some road freight, but also mainly industry for basic chemicals, other metals, and paper. And the largest chunk of that will be covered with imports, and then we have some that is covered with domestic production in Germany with renewables. Fifth strategy, and I've mentioned that before, is CCS. After 2030, we have to ramp up CCS infrastructure in order to be able to actually account for those 5% rest emissions in 2045. And here we use mainly biomass CCS or bioelectric CCS for steel and chemicals, but also direct air capture and some green polymers in industry. So how does that look in the sectors? And again, electricity, we will have to accelerate the coal phase out until 2030. How that is done is still up for discussion, but if we actually want to meet the 2030 target, this means coal phase out, and not by 2038, but by 2030. And it also means increasing the expansion rate to 70% rest in 2030, and then roughly 100 by 2045. You can see also that the electricity generation will increase drastically to about 1,000 terawatt hours in 2045. This is also and mainly due to the usage of electricity in the sectors that are currently still relying on oil and gas. In the transport sector, however, or not however, the transport sector will mainly be electrified. And you can see here on the left that almost all vehicles by 2045 and even 2050 will be electrified with battery electric vehicles, and only a small part is a very, very small part is based on fuel cell vehicles. On the right side, you can see that the model still says there's a much more hydrogen with fuel cell in the truck sector, but we already see here as well that the political and also the strategic development of the companies producing those trucks is turning towards more electric vehicles as well. But you can see also here that the amount of cars on the left side is decreased until 2045, 2050, which mainly means we have to have much more new mobility concepts, especially in the urban areas in Germany. In buildings, and you can see here finally, the final energy demand is decreasing, and that actually means we have to renovate much, much, much more than we do currently to decrease the final energy demand in the building sector to roughly 460, 420 terawatt hours in 2045 and 50. And then whatever we have to produce with for the heating of those buildings will be produced with heat pumps or green district heating in those city centers. So also here, we will move away from oil and gas and towards electricity. Hydrogen really doesn't play a role in our models here, especially because we need it in other sectors much more urgently than we do in the heating sector, where we can easily use heat pumps and district heating systems. In the industry, again, hydrogen, electrification, and some industrial biomass will become the backbone, replacing coal, natural gas, and also other oil-based systems. You can see that here. And then also here, some more efficiency is modeled, where we can see that until 2035, the final energy consumption of the industry sector is decreasing, but then is roughly stable around 600 terawatt hours. In conclusion, this means that we have 3 steps towards climate neutrality in 2045. And the title is actually wrong here, obviously, but it said the title of the graph. But we will have to have a path with 3 steps toward climate neutrality in 2045, with the first step reducing emissions by 65% until 2030, then 95% until 2045, and then account for the last emissions with negative emissions so that we can actually reach 100% climate emissions reduction by 2045. You can see here also that then going further into the future, with following this path, we can be net negative by 2050. The climate law that was now proposed, it just passed the governmental cabinet and has to be now taken into parliament, both the Bundestag and the Bundesrat, so the federal level and the state level, in the next month, and is supposed to be actually finalized in this legislative period. The legislative period ends on September 26th, so it will probably be finalized in the week before, according to the current timeline. And it essentially says, and this is new and this is also quite big, climate neutrality by 2045. We have increased ambition for 2030, which is actually in line with the current EU target. So it does not mean that that Germany is pushing the EU towards a higher target, but it's basically following what the EU just has proposed with the new EU target of minus 55%. It now includes the emission of the LULUCF sector, which is also quite comparable to what the EU has currently on the table, but Matthias will go into depth on this one. And then additionally, the government has proposed some additional measures, some immediate additional measures. However, it is unclear whether they will follow the current timeline of the law as well, mainly because they're actually quite big. It says we have to increase the CO2 price in the ESD sectors with the so-called BEHG, Brennstoffemissionshandelsgesetz, so fuel emission trading law. I'm not sure whether that's the correct translation of it. However, it mainly says we have to increase the current price for heating and transport, which are the two sectors that are covered more or less in this law, to I think 45%, 45 euros in 2022, which is still on the table. Again, we're not sure whether this will actually materialize in this legislative period. But also they would like to increase RAS capacity additions drastically, as of course they have to. However, again, not sure whether this will materialize. It also assumes that there will be another reform in 2022, so next year, because this first reform now is a reaction to the Constitutional Court. However, the Constitutional Court has said you have time until the end of 2022 to actually account for the whole package. So this is the first reform. The second reform will then rather answer to the finalization of the EU legislation next year. And it says, well, we of course need to have additional measures for hydrogen, for industry, for transport, for agriculture, and also for building renovation. However, it only states we have to do something. And of course, if we look at that, yes, we do need to have additional measures. So until to actually account for climate neutrality 2045 and maintain 65% greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, we need to adapt the policy mix much sooner than everyone would actually believe, and actually has believed in the past half year, because this is how long we've been talking about this already now. We need to look at all the sectors and look at what do we need to do in every single sector. Some in energy, buildings, transport, industry, and agriculture, but also we need to have a Climate Change Act as a framework law, which is now on the table, of course. We need to increase the carbon price. Again, this was announced, but we don't really know whether this will materialize. And a third thing that kind of is part of the discussion, but it's not really materialized either, make climate-related risk transparent to financial markets. So essentially, this is a really nice framework. We have now on the table new targets, and we have ambitious targets on the table. They answer to the EU legislation. We have climate neutrality 2045, which is already finally some actual number in a law in Germany. However, this is of course a framework. It's a set of targets, but we need to see how to get there. And all of this getting there includes demands much more measures, much more policy that is actually going into the sectors and thinking about how do we actually transform the sector from here towards there. We know that industry is already asking for this. They need to have now some framework to transform their sector, because the investments have to be done today, and whatever is built today will actually be still in place and in action in 2045. Hence, every investment that is done today needs to be already climate neutral. They will have to be able to do that. So we also hope, like from a German perspective, that we will be able to do this with the EU in our back. And I'm really happy to now turn over to Matthias for giving us a brief look into what are the implications for the EU Green Deal on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mara. And Mara and I decided to just continue straight into the European perspective. Now, the focus of what I'm presenting is not on the Green Deal. We've covered this in other publications and webinars, but more trying to get a first sense of what the change dynamics in the German context could imply for the package negotiation that is about to start in Brussels. Next slide, Mara, please. Mara, thanks. And to help you and us put this into perspective, here's a simple timeline starting on the left in December last year and then moving to the end of 2021. So we had a European Council in December last year, which adopted the increased 2030 climate target for Europe, as well as an historically large European budget that not only included the regular EU budget, but also the EU's recovery budget from the Corona-induced economic crisis, Next Generation EU. the EU legislator had already worked for almost a year by that time on a proposal by the Commission on a European climate law that is making the long-term climate target or climate neutrality objective legally binding on the Union and the member states, as well as setting an increased 2030 climate target, the -55%, which heads of state agreed to in December. So on the 21st of April, a few days before the Constitutional Court ruling in Germany, we had a political compromise in the so-called trilogue formation on the European climate law. I could say a few more words on that. I may do that later. Then now we are already looking into the future. At the EU level, we are now expecting next week to a meeting of EU heads of state on the 25th of May. And climate is on the agenda, and heads of state are expected to give some final political guidance to the Commission on the so-called Fit for 55 legislative package. So the 55, of course, is the 55%, and the fit is the effort to update the European climate and energy laws to deliver the 55% net domestic reductions by 2030. What is clear today is that there will be two steps. There will be a first chunk of legislation published on the 14th of July by the Commission, and we are expecting at the moment a second chunk, second part of this Fit for 55 package in Q4. My understanding is it will be in December, and there will also be some other elements like an update of state aid guidance and also some new measures on circular economy. And if you look now at the German timeline, you do see that the Constitutional Court judgment has really put the German debate a bit on a fast forward on climate. Everybody in Germany knew and expected that with the federal elections on the 26th of September, there would be a more, let's say, proactive government on climate be put into office, coming into office, because climate is a very important issue in the German debate. But the Constitutional Court judgment really has fast forwarded the German debate in the run-up to the elections, and now, as Mara described, resulted in the very speedy adoption or proposition of an updated climate law that would enshrine -65% for German climate greenhouse gas reductions by 2030 in German law. Next slide, please. So a few words on the European climate law that I mentioned. We have a political compromise. It's not yet binding, legally binding, but it will become binding in some weeks. It sets a legally binding target for 2030 of at least 55% net domestic greenhouse gas reductions compared to 1990 levels. And the objective, as well legally binding, to reach climate neutrality at the latest by 2050. Importantly, this is a domestic target. So it does refer to emissions after the deduction of removals. There was an agreement in the political compromise that the contribution of removals towards the 2030 target would be limited to 220 million ton of CO2 equivalents, which slightly reduces the absolute reduction target to 52.8%, excluding sinks. And as well as part of the political compromise, the Commission announced and agreed that it will propose to revise the LULUCF regulation, which is the land use sectors regulation, to increase the EU carbon sink to levels above 300 million tons CO2 equivalent, which would add to the greenhouse gas reductions and to some calculations to achieve a net 57% target for 2030. Next slide, please. Now, what does this mean? I will not go through this because that's not the focus really of this presentation. I just want to highlight a few points to show that what Mara has been reporting on the 2045 Climate Neutral Germany study very well matches with the expectations on the EU 55% reduction pathway by 2030. So just to give you some examples, Mara mentioned 70% renewables in the power mix. According to the underlying modeling of the Commission, we would be expecting 68% renewables in the power mix by 2030 Europe-wide. Mara mentioned 40 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030. Europe-wide expectation is that this would be about 50 million electric vehicles. Mara mentioned 5.6 million heat pumps in buildings, and the Commission modeling suggests 50 million heat pumps Europe-wide. So you see there is a very strong consistency between what's coming out as main messages from the German perspective and what the European Commission modeling is suggesting will be the reduction pathway towards 2030 for Europe. Also to mention, perhaps I didn't make it explicit, that towards 2030, we do expect a complete phasing out of coal use for electricity production all across Europe. Next slide, please. Now, if you remember, it will be 14th of July, first part of the Fit for 55 package. This will include 9 legislative proposals at least. They're listed here at the right side. I will not go through, but if you have questions, I'm happy to take up some questions. We have done a self-standing report on this, but of course, very similar to the debate in Germany that is now turning to measures. As well, the European level debate is turning to measures, and the measures to deliver the minus 55% Europe-wide will be articulated in these different legal instruments. The first package presented on the 14th of July, so the day of the French Revolution, which hopefully will also initiate Europe's climate revolution. Next slide, please. So to sum up, the European context for the German debate, we're expecting this 14th of July package that has a number, it will address a number of parts of the picture. If you remember the house that, or the temple that Mara was showing, so it's a similar logic. We have some cross-sectoral instruments, the emissions trading system, energy taxation directive, climate action regulation, LULUCF, renewables and efficiency. And then we have some measures specifically related to industry and some measures specifically related to transport. Mara, next click, please. There will be a second part in Q4, which broadly deals with fossil and non-fossil gases. So it will be buildings efficiency. There's an EU directive that will be updated and a gas package and also addressing methane. Click please, Mara. And at this point, we are, from our perspective, still missing some elements to really complete the measures discussion at the EU level that would be important not only for Germany, but indeed for all member states to then rapidly accelerate the domestic climate action. We are for some time calling what we dubbed a clean industry for Europe package, so a very robust investment framework legally and financially for European industry to move towards climate neutrality. This will need to include specific provisions on state aids, more specific measures to scale lead markets for climate neutral products, and also pick up on the circular economy concept, which is really very important to reduce industry emissions. And then we do have, in addition to the European climate law, which is more like the framework law on target setting in Europe, we have a so-called European Energy Union Governance Regulation, which is much more addressing the generic relationship of the EU climate energy level to the national climate and energy work, focusing on national planning for the transition, so-called national energy and climate plans, and really trying to help member states to take a holistic approach to prepare for the transition. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of a concluding and reflecting slide, and I'm sure that in the discussion we will probably dive deeper into some of those points. So what does the German climate target increase imply for Europe and for the dynamics on the package, on the Fit for 55 package? As Mara said already, in our understanding, the German 65% 2030 target is in line with what you would expect under the current sharing of efforts, with the expected German contribution to the 55% European target, which means that the acceleration that has now happened in Germany does not imply that the European target will also be increased even further. Personally, I would doubt this after the political agreement just reached in the trilogue a few weeks ago. But of course, politically, now with Germany, and Germany, of course, is not alone. There are a number of other member states that have already committed to climate neutrality. Austria, the Nordics in particular, just to mention a few countries, but now Germany also has is on the way to make it legally binding under national law to achieve climate neutrality by 2045. And of course, this does put pressure on other member states that have not yet set national climate neutrality targets to do so quite soon. At the moment, we have the situation that the European climate law will make the 2050 climate neutrality objective, at least by latest climate neutrality objective, legally binding on the Union and the member states, but it doesn't mean that it articulates specific target dates for the member states. That is not part of the European climate law. So this still is left for national legislation and the national governments to do. The expectation is, as Mara said, we now have that the new German government, after the election in September, will have to adopt further measures. It is very clear all sectors need to rapidly accelerate climate action, the same as is the message from a European perspective. So the debate will, in Germany after the election, very much move to, so how do we deliver concretely? Now, if you are a bit familiar with the interplay between European law and national law, it is very often the case that some adjustments to European climate and energy law will actually facilitate accelerated climate action at the national level. Just to give an example for climate neutral industry, of course, governments will be moving to support in some part climate neutral industry investments, for instance, climate neutral green steel production through so-called carbon contracts for difference. This does raise some questions under European state aid law. And of course, in that context, some adjustments to how European state aid law would be applied would facilitate and give certainty to member states what to do. In some other cases, EU-level measures are actually the most suitable lever to accelerate climate actions. To give you an example, CO2 standards for cars, vans, lorries. This is EU harmonized legislation because of the strong internal market component, also strengthening carbon pricing for a set of reasons is best done at EU level if it is through the emissions trading system or whether it is through setting basic disciplines on energy taxation. And wherever you're talking about market development, like for clean industry, of course, the European legislator is the place to look. Also discussions that are now happening in different countries at the same time throughout Europe, also elsewhere, on what is the end date, for instance, for the sale of cars with internal combustion engines. There are good legal arguments to suggest that this needs to be a European legislation, a European law articulating such an end date because of the internal market implications. So what's the conclusion from all of this? The Fit for 55 package negotiations, so Europe updating its climate laws to deliver the 55%, this will really pick up momentum only in 2022. So after a new German government has taken office, after they are really pressed to accelerate the domestic debate on measures. So from that perspective, I would expect that the new German government will be very proactively in the European debate, to be pushing for ambitious outcomes in the Fit for 5 negotiations right from the start. To do, as I was hinting at, to have the best supportive European legal context for the acceleration in Germany. But of course, as the bigger picture on Europe as such is also showing, Germany is not going it alone, but all of Europe is now moving into this direction, because 55% emission reductions mean very similar transition pathways all throughout Europe. That's it from my side as a first input. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What a ride. Thanks for guiding us through these more than 30 slides. And we already see a few questions in the Q&A box. I can imagine there will be more because people were probably following closely. But maybe Claire already has picked a few that she'd like to ask you. Enjoy.
Sorry, typical mistake. I forgot to unmute myself. So hello from my side. Hello from Brussels to our audience. Yes, we do already have quite a number of questions. We'll start with the question from Maren Preuss. You said meeting the targets means coal phase out by 2030. Can this be achieved by an increase in carbon prices, or do you see a need or a possibility for a new coal phase out law?
Matthias, do you want me to take this one first?
Please, yes.
Add on? Honestly, I think the current ETS kind of points towards the market is doing its share. But by share, we actually mean share. I assume that eventually the German government will have to face the question of what do we do when this becomes much quicker, much faster than we currently anticipate. Currently, they are still saying 2038 it is. So we will see. I believe it kind of depends on the dynamics of the ETS and how much the markets actually drive towards a phase out themselves. But of course, part of the coal phase out law is also financial remuneration of those regions and financial support for the structural change. And if all of this becomes much faster, we will of course have to have an open discussion what that actually means for those regions as well. Maybe Matthias would like to add.
Just to add, it's at the moment really a moving picture and dynamic situation. Yes. The current government has came out explicitly, and this was Armin Laschet as well as Angela Merkel, said we will not now reopen the coal compromise that was achieved just a year ago and put into legislation, which foresees a phase-out date by 2038 and includes a whole range of agreements, as Mara was hinting to, for the regions to be supported in their transition out of coal mining and coal use, etc. So this is, of course, a debate to be had, because all the numbers indicate that simply through the market tightening for emission permits under the European emissions trading system to make it consistent with the higher ambition in Europe and in Germany, we will see a much faster coal phase out than was anticipated when the coal compromise for Germany was debated.
And also actually achieving the minus 65% target without a drastic change in coal electricity production, we don't see possible.
All right, thank you for this. So a question from Johan Gottschling. Given the vast amount of renewable energies needed to replace the capacity from coal and nuclear phase out, I wonder how we can repeat the success in wind and PV installation from the past. We see a general acceptance, for renewables in Germany, but when it comes to the implementation of individual projects of wind power or grid extension, there is a lot of social resistance. Would you like to answer this one?
Of course. Yes, this has been a large problem in the past years, that we see a lack of acceptance for especially wind power projects, onshore wind power projects. But we also see that this will or may become a problem for large free field PV, larger PV as well. And the government has already put some ideas into action. The current RES law that is on the table and has been proposed includes something like a community remuneration that helps local governments to actually have some kind of local benefit, like a financial local benefit, which is at least one step in the right direction. But of course, acceptance is a much broader thing. It's about how to actually illustrate what kind of importance every single wind farm, every single windmill, every single PV plant has on this way towards climate neutrality. And I would like to point you towards a study that we have published last year on this called Acceptance. It's our acceptance paper. I would say it's an impulse, and bundling all of these questions together, how to actually tackle acceptance for renewable energies from a political point of view, and especially from the federal level. And of course, this is not only a federal question, but it is also something that has implications for every single state, but also on the communal level. And I would say it's a very large package that needs to be put together here, and there has to be clear rules on how to get there. We have to have better explanations on every single level, but also clear rules on where do we put those windmills and where do we not put those windmills? Where do we put power plants or PV power plants, and where do we not put them? And this is a question that is not only a very specific question on the acceptance issues and the policy for acceptance, but also on how to put the approval process in a better system. How do we get faster and quicker to actual approval of single plants, but also take into account how do we put renewables expansion and natural conservation into a very fitting picture together. And all of this needs to be put onto the road. And this is, of course, one of the measures that have to be taken very quickly, and that is currently addressed slightly, but not really sufficiently in our view. Hence, this is certainly one of the things that need to be part of any immediate action package that has to be put into place as soon as the new legislative period starts. Because to be honest, I do not see that the current legislative period will cover that as well. I mean, we are 4 months into 4 months close to the end.
But perhaps to add to what Mara was saying, so in addition to these, let's say, these different levels to increase to increase the speed of renewables deployment, to me, it really boils down to political leadership. We haven't had the senior government politicians in Europe in charge of the energy transition really coming out and explaining to the public why a much faster scaling of renewables is necessary and how it fits into the bigger picture. And then, of course, to go to the more, let's say, granular ways of how you can balance the interest in maintaining the countryside in a healthy environment, also the financial interest of municipalities where in the backyard wind parks may be established. But to me, we really have seen very little political leadership in support of faster scaling of renewables in the past years, not only in Germany, but also in other countries in Europe. And this needs to change and will hopefully change with a new government. And then it probably will take some time before the message has really been understood. Because as the question was, I think, pointing to very correctly, is there's a real mismatch at the moment in the minds of many citizens. Yes, I'm in support of climate action and renewables, but please don't touch me now.
Right. Yes. A question from Nitin Jain, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Do you anticipate with the change in political situation, the change of government in Germany, that the targets, the deadlines will be revised, or that they will be more stringent? And does this not affect then the GDP growth projection for Germany? Yeah, so basically with a change of government in Germany, how this will affect the GDP growth projections, and how it will affect the setting of new targets, more stringent climate targets. And so basically it's a question combining climate action and economic growth for a country such as an industrial country like Germany.
Do you want to go first? Maybe I can add.
Yeah, Mara was on the 2045 study. The headline message is, this is not, I don't know how you call this, sufficiency or building back scenario, but this is actually assuming a steady economic growth over the years. So at similar levels that we have seen and in a way gotten used to, but at the same time, really investing into reducing greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors. And we know from a number of studies, so first the GDP question is answered already, I think, by Mara. So this is not a degrowth scenario, but it's actually expecting some GDP expansion as we have seen in the past. At the same time, there are many, many studies, even from consultants working for industry, underpinning the message again and again that investing into the clean transition is a very good business case. It is creating jobs, it's improving health, air quality is improved, it's less noisy, it's greener, particularly in a city environment. So it is really improving the livelihoods, and it is creating a lot of employment opportunities. Of course, there are also some situations, and this is specifically for the coal phase out, we have been debating this in Germany, where currently existing employment will have to retrain, perhaps change. And of course, this might also be the case in other sectors, and there are some question marks on the automobile industry, the supply, the companies supplying to build internal combustion engines. The important message for in all those debates is, first, you cannot stop the climate crisis if you just continue doing as we're doing. And then, of course, the earlier you start to invest into the new clean future, and the earlier you take it seriously that there will need to be a change in the way things are done, the much more manageable, much more socially acceptable are the changes that will need to happen in some parts, in some areas, in some just jobs as they exist currently. So let's start immediately to take it seriously. And we've gone through this in Germany for coal. There are also some readouts, Mara, I believe, on the coal compromise. And one of the messages I took from the debate is, of course, if you are starting to discuss the future of employment in the coal industry in Germany in 2018, it is still some years ahead. And a large part of the workforce might be on retirement there, and others are still very young and can be retrained.
Maybe adding one thing,
yes.
The growth or the GDP growth in our, on this one slide, growth is not a result of our modeling. It's one of the input parameters. So we do not expect this growth as a result of the model, but we said we have to model a growth scenario. We have to make this possible while still anticipating GDP growth. As Matthias already said, because this is an investment scenario, we are talking about how to actually transform and not minimize our economy on this. So again, we cannot really say, well, if we change a certain parameter, this will change the growth, but rather say we expect growth. We have to make this possible with growth. Of course, kind of this may change a little bit the understanding here.
Right. So a question from Farah M. Valencia. In the current German debate, fossil fuel subsidy reform, like the one on kerosene, is being addressed, while carbon pricing and new vehicle standards, for example, can address the issue of subsidy reforms indirectly. Will there be direct language on an EU level that will move more countries towards reforming fossil fuel subsidies? That was a question to yes,
Matthias, probably.
Yeah, I mean, this is an issue that is not a new issue, and in the EU there have been many times debates on eliminating some fossil fuel subsidies. When it comes to hard choices so far, some subsidies have been amazingly resistant to change, but it will remain an issue. Yeah, I think this is probably the most you could say on it, because essentially the whole, let's say, the fiscal competence is not an EU competence, but it's very much a member state competence. The European legislator or the European level has some say when it comes to subsidies, particularly via state aid disciplines. But at least in the past, the state aid framework has not been used vigorously to push for an elimination of subsidies to fossil fuels in any shape or form. It's an interesting question whether this could or should change. The Commission has done a broad consultation earlier this year on the recasting of the European competition and state aid framework to make it consistent with the Green Deal and the climate neutrality objective. And of course, those points have come up repeatedly, including from, let's say, rather, really conservative lawyers making the point that for consistency, there would need to be a general checking whether state aid given by governments is consistent with the Green Deal objectives and climate neutrality. And of course, for some fossil fuel subsidies, that might not be the case.
Good. A question from Émilie Legendre in Paris. A climate action tracker said a few days ago that the new Germany's proposed 2030 national target is not yet 1.5 degrees compatible, saying that to be in line with this limit, the target should aim for national emission reductions of at least 69% below 1990 levels. What is your point of view on this analysis? Further efforts to increase and accelerate the ambition can be achieved?
Can I come back to the colleague bilaterally, because we have also seen that mentioned. For us, it is not fully clear how the calculation has been done, to what extent it only relates to CO2 emissions or also the whole set of greenhouse gas emissions. If you allow, we come back to you, because we were also seeing that, of course, and wondering what it means.
All right, okay. So a question from Michael Engelhardt. Would an ETS for all CO2 emissions in Germany a good idea, and would it be feasible?
Well, we already started to put the non-ETS sectors into a climate or into a CO2 pricing scheme with the so-called BEHG, and which covers mainly transport and buildings so far. And currently, we have a fixed price in this scheme so far, and it's increasing over the next years, and then it is transferred into a trading scheme, more or less, with a floor and a maximum price at the beginning, and then the debate is kind of open. So we already put some of these sectors into this price pressure, more or less. And of course, this has all been done with kind of having in the back of our minds, or having in the back of the mind, that these sectors will be integrated into the ETS sooner or later as well. Of course, this debate is quite open currently, and a one price for all mechanism would, of course, change the story for some sectors, because all of these sectors have very different avoidance prices with their measures. Hence, I think the debate is currently rather open whether that's it's a good idea to put it all into one thing, or whether it's a rather diverse strategy. At least from a German perspective. Matthias, maybe you want to add to that a little.
We have a very similar debate from the European perspective, where essentially the debate is zooming in on would it be useful to have, in addition to the emissions trading system as it stands at the moment, covering the power sector and parts of industry, that there would be what the head of Timmermans' cabinet called an adjacent ETS created for transport and buildings, kicking in a bit more upstream at the fuel supplier, so a bit like the BHG in Germany. And the debate is open. We will only know when the Commission will propose the first part of the package in July, where exactly we're moving. My personal expectation is that the Commission will clearly not propose an economy-wide ETS. That's off the table. It is pushed by most member states to increase, to broadly stay in the current framework of emissions trading system and so-called effort sharing regulation for the non-trading sectors. And so the expected outcome, in my view, is to have essentially an update of those two pillars, and then to have in additional adjacent. ETS for the buildings and transport sectors that would in a way create a minimum carbon price for those sectors across Europe. And then the question, of course, is how you deal with the different impacts in different member states of a similar carbon price. But for the reasons Mara mentioned, that some of the prices could go very high, very fast if you're really using the ETS as the main compliance tool to reduce emissions in Europe. There will be a debate on a cap of such a pricing instrument for buildings and transport. And of course, there will also need to be a debate on the interrelationship of the sector regulation legislation, let's say the CO2 standards for cars, and the supportive unified CO2 price signal coming from an ETS for transport in Europe. Because the less you do on the standards, the more you must do on the price, with all the also some of the challenges coming with it. And the more you do on the regulation, the less you must deliver via the price. But for many reasons, at least a basic CO2 price signal all across Europe would be very helpful to accelerate the transition, because it simply would make the business case for direct electrification much earlier in many sectors. Yeah? Just take the example of question, how affordable is it still to have an oil-fired or gas-fired heating system in your home vis-a-vis using heat pumps, if electricity or increasingly clean electricity is significantly more expensive, as it currently is in most member states, compared to use of oil and gas that emit carbon when burned, then of course it is more difficult to really have make it also economically attractive for households or landlords to then invest into a new heating system for buildings. So we would see a very clear benefit of an adjacent ETS for transported buildings also in Europe. Whether it's proposed, let's see, 14th of July.
All right, so I have a question regarding agriculture and meat demand. A question from Arthur Clare. You would also need to act on a meat demand in order to really have an impact on CO2 emissions. Otherwise, Germany would only increase its meat imports. And in the end, CO2 consumption from this sector may remain stable, just not accounted to in Germany. What are your recommendations on that topic?
That's a really good question. And I believe I would like to add a comment on this one. When we decided on the assumptions for agriculture, especially when it came to meat consumption and meat production in Germany, we went a very conservative route and just took what the trends were from the past years and then extended them for the next few years. We felt already very bold with that, but some feedback that we got, especially in the fall, was the agriculture sector, especially when it came to meat consumption, there's more in it. And I believe that is true, but at the same time, when we looked at the debate around the new proposed climate law in the last few weeks, we also saw that the sector was the one that was mostly debated on how much can it actually deliver in general when it came to the reduction of emissions in general. And I believe this is one of the most highly debated questions in Germany in the current debate when it comes to the agricultural sector is meat consumption. And because mainly, of course, this is a question that goes very strictly into the behavior of individuals. And of course, this sector is the one that also will have to see lots of measures and instruments. And we have consulted at least with the Stiftung Klimaneutralität on an instrument study that they are conducting currently on this, and that will be published in the next few weeks with some of some answers to actually these questions and how to address the reduction of meat consumption in general, but also the other questions that that come up in the agriculture sector when it comes to wetting more lands, but also other emissions from fertilizers, for example. Hence, this is a huge question, and I agree that if we only reduce production and not consumption, then this will be just an exported problem in general. Hence, yes, this is a question that needs to be tackled as well. But in my experience from the last few months is that, this is the sector where we will see all of the discussions that we have had in the energy sector for the past 10 years coming up now with how much can they deliver, how will they deliver. And my impression was also that with this study, we kind of put the spotlight on the agriculture sector as well, because right now they're the smallest sector, the sector with the least share in emissions in general. But when it comes to 2050 or 2045, of course, they will amount for large parts of the remaining emissions. Those are the 5% that we have to tackle. And in the end, this is the sector that needs to be offset with negative emissions. So if we reduce more, of course, we will have to offset much less in the end. So agriculture, huge problem. Meat consumption, certainly a topic that needs to be tackled. And I'm sure that we will see much proposals, but also much discussion about it in the next few years.
Okay, thank you for that. So, sorry, a question regarding heat pumps from Günther Unzeld. Mm-hmm. I did not see any effort to reduce the high electricity price in the private sector in Germany. Is anything planned in this area to help promoting heat pumps in a private building sector?
Yes, well, thank you for this question. Of course, the price itself was not a question of this study, of the 2045 study, because obviously this is a question that goes more into policy, and this was not necessarily a policy question, but rather a policy study. It was rather a study on the pathway and the emission possibility or reduction possibilities that we have. But of course, the question of how to accelerate the usage of heat pumps in Germany depends highly on the electricity price and whether electricity is actually in the role of being a cheaper version to oil and gas. And it all boils down to that in the end, is our impression. We can subsidize heat pumps as much as we want. If the electricity price is still as it is today, we will of course not see it. Currently, what we do in Germany is use what we have in what we earn, or what we collect from the CO2 pricing on oil and gas to reduce the EEG surcharge, which is part of the household electricity price and is used to accelerate the capacity additions in renewable energies and helps to support it. And it's more or less a separate mechanism apart from the federal budget. And we use this money to decrease or lower the EEG surcharge. And with increasing CO2 pricing that makes fossil usage more expensive, we can reduce the electricity price and essentially make it much more competitive against any other technology. At the same time, we are sure that this will probably not be sufficient to actually lower the electricity price enough for heat pumps, so that we have to have additional measures in the long run. At the same time, and this is a figure I just saw last week, we saw that in the last year, for the first time in new buildings, there were more heat pumps installed than any other technology, which is really great. I mean, we are on the right path here. We just have to accelerate this at a much better and higher pace than we do today. And electricity price and lowering the electricity price for that is certainly one of the key political questions. And again, here, I think I would like to cite Matthias on this, because he stated it earlier, we need to have political leadership here as well. We need to show politically that this is the technology that can put us on the path toward climate neutrality. And the current political setup here, or policy setup here, is certainly not telling that story.
To add on, Mr. Unselt, my colleagues Patrick Greichen and Thorsten Lenk published a very short calculation 10 days ago. You find it on our website, just looking into the potential for reducing further the EEG-Umlage by using the revenues from the increased BHG price for that purpose, and how much where it would come out to. And of course, this is part of broader conceptual work we've been doing on reforming the system of taxes, levies, and charges in Germany, which at the moment, really unhelpfully increase the price of end consumer electricity and putting it as a disadvantage compared to gas and oil.
Right, so I guess we have time for one more question, and it's a question regarding the Fit for 55 package. A question from Olaf Litviakov. Have I understood correctly that you expect some ETS or comparable approach to be proposed for the buildings, heating sector as part of the Fit for 55 package?
Thank you for the question. So this is something that was announced by Ursula von der Leyen as President of the European Commission, and also points made repeatedly by Vice President Timmermans, who is in charge of the Green Deal, that this, at least until very recently, is the intention. How exactly this would look like is still open, because we haven't seen the proposals. They only come out on the 14th of July. If you want to get our perspective on the details of how this could look like, you can find it in our benchmarks for success report that we published a few days ago, in the second section on kind of the climate action regulation update, plus the introduction of an ETS for transport and buildings, how this could look like and what would be some of the key points there. Thank you, Robin, for putting it into the window.
Good. I think Nicola. Yes.
Yes, I'm back. Let me take over. Thank you very much, Matthias and Mara, for being on the podium, presenting and answering all the questions. Thanks for, that was the bell you now heard. Thanks for asking the questions. There are still quite a few unanswered. If there's anything burning under your nails, write us an email to webinar@agora-energiewende.de, or maybe just have a look at the different studies. At the moment, only the short versions have been published on the website in German and in English. We will have a long version in German. I don't know at the moment when exactly. In order to be amongst the first to receive it, why don't you register for our newsletter if you're not yet on the mailing list? And maybe Robin can post the link to the newsletter registration site again into the chat. Maybe you could also put the link again to the presentation that Mara and Matthias showed into the chat, and you will be able to re-watch the recording, or to watch the recording, I should think at the beginning of next week at the latest. You'll find it on the website in the events section, and we will also inform you via newsletter. Now, let me see, have I forgotten anything? No, not really. So that was it for today. It's 12:31, so a minute run over time, but I think that's okay. I let you now go to have a lunch, or if it's already evening, then maybe dinner, or if it's early in the morning in Brazil, then maybe you have your second breakfast or something. Bear with us. We will have, I think, at least one public event for the next 6 weeks or so until summertime in Germany. So I'm sure we'll meet again and wish you a good rest of the day. We on the podium, maybe Robin can switch on the camera also now. Thank you also. I forgot to mention that. We will stay here for another 10 to 20 seconds, so you're not too abruptly kicked out of this meeting. And of course, you can still say thank you and put things like that into the chat, because this is always nice to receive it, only if you liked it. Yeah, so see you next time and stay healthy. Bye-bye.
Bye.